You follow? Well, with the Mark 7 Jag, it understeered like mad because of the anti-roll bar up there. But by changing the whole driving method, you could sort of skate the car around in the tighter stuff and always have drive to the rear wheels, so that was the crux of it. People have asked me the same question for years. They ask about the World Championship in 1961. They ask about Ferrari. They ask about Le Mans. Sometimes they ask about the danger we accepted every time we climbed into those cars. Those are the stories people expect to hear from me, and I understand why. They were remarkable years, filled with moments that shaped not only my career, but also the history of Formula One. But every now and then someone asks a question that makes me pause before answering. They ask me who the greatest drivers were that I ever had the privilege to witness. That's a much harder question than naming the fastest man or the one with the most trophies. Formula One has never been that simple. Speed can win you a race, a great car can win you a championship, but greatness is something entirely different. It's something you recognize long before the statistics are written into the record books. You see it in the way a driver thinks, the way he carries himself when things go wrong, the way an entire paddock quietly pays attention whenever he goes out on track. I've been fortunate enough to share this sport with some truly extraordinary men. Some were champions, some deserved to be champions. All of them left an impression on me that lasted far longer than any checkered flag. These aren't simply the greatest drivers I ever saw. They're the men who changed the way I understood what it meant to race. Let me start with the man who set the standard long before most of us ever dreamed of becoming world champions. Juan Manuel Fangio. By the time I was finding my place in European racing, Fangio was already more than just a successful driver. He had become the benchmark. I still remember how people spoke about him in the paddock. It wasn't loud admiration or exaggerated praise. It was quieter than that. Engineers listened when he talked. Team owners trusted his judgment. Even rival drivers carried themselves differently when his name came up. You could sense that everyone knew they were watching someone very special. What made Fangio so different was never just his speed. Plenty of drivers were fearless enough to drive flat out in those days. What separated him from everyone else was his understanding of a race long before it unfolded. He seemed to know exactly when to push, when to protect the car, when to save the tires, and when to wait for the opportunity that everyone else failed to see. Watching him was like watching someone solve a complicated puzzle while the rest of us were still trying to understand the pieces. He also possessed something that is much harder to describe than raw talent. He adapted better than anyone I had ever seen. Different teams, different engineers, different machinery, it never seemed to matter. Alfa Romeo, Maserati, Mercedes-Benz, Ferrari, wherever he went, he somehow found a way to make the entire operation work around him without creating chaos. That isn't just driving ability, that's complete mastery of the profession. I think many fans remember Fangio because he won 5 world championships, and that certainly deserves respect. But those of us who competed during that era admired something else. He rarely looked rushed. Even under enormous pressure, he drove with a calmness that almost seemed impossible in a sport where one mistake could cost your life. That composure spread through an entire team. When Fangio believed everything was under control, everyone else believed it too. The race that always comes to mind is the 1957 German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring. Even years later, drivers still talked about it with genuine disbelief. After an unusually long pit stop dropped him well behind the Ferraris of Mike Hawthorne and Peter Collins, most people assumed the race was over. Instead, Fangio produced lap after lap that many still consider among the greatest ever driven. He broke the lap record repeatedly, erased an enormous deficit, caught both Ferraris, passed them, and won the race. It wasn't simply a comeback. It was a demonstration of absolute control over both the machine and his own emotions. Performances like that don't happen because someone is willing to take bigger risks. They happen because someone understands exactly where the limit is and somehow lives there. That race taught me something I carried throughout my own career. Winning isn't always about finding one spectacular lap. More often, it's about making hundreds of perfect decisions that nobody notices until the checkered flag falls. Whenever people ask me who came closest to perfection behind the wheel, my mind has always returned to Juan Manuel Fangio. He didn't just show us how to drive racing cars. He showed us how intelligence, patience, and discipline could become the greatest weapons a driver would ever possess. Now, this one is different. If Fangio represented perfection through patience, Stirling Moss represented perfection through instinct. The first time I really watched Stirling at work, I understood almost immediately why so many people believed he was the fastest man in the world. He drove with an aggression that looked effortless, yet there was always precision underneath it. Some drivers attacked every corner because they had no other choice. Stirling attacked because he knew exactly how much grip he had left. There was an intelligence behind every movement of the car that television cameras could never fully capture. What made him so difficult was never simply his courage. Formula One in our era demanded courage from everyone. If you didn't have it, you wouldn't survive very long. What separated Stirling was his ability to adapt faster than anyone else. Give him a wet circuit, and somehow he found speed where everyone else found uncertainty. Put him in an underpowered car, and he'd still find himself fighting against machines that should have disappeared into the distance. He could qualify brilliantly, overtake cleanly, and manage a race without ever looking like he was forcing the issue. That kind of versatility is incredibly rare. Most drivers have conditions they prefer. Some love high-speed circuits. Others need a particular type of car to feel comfortable. Stirling never seemed limited by those things. Whether he was driving for Mercedes, Maserati, Van Wall, or a private team, he adapted almost immediately. He trusted his instincts, and more often than not, those instincts were exactly right. What I admired most was the confidence he inspired without ever trying to dominate a room. He didn't need dramatic speeches or psychological games. His driving spoke loudly enough. If you knew Stirling was starting alongside you, you also knew there was a good chance he'd find a way to challenge you before the afternoon was over. That wasn't intimidation. It was simply respect earned through consistency. One race I always think about is the 1961 Monaco Grand Prix. On paper, the privately entered Lotus he drove simply shouldn't have beaten Ferrari. Our cars were stronger, more powerful, and better suited to that season. Logic suggested the race belonged to us. Stirling ignored logic. Around the narrow streets of Monaco, he drove one of the finest races I've ever witnessed. Lap after lap, he extracted everything that Lotus could possibly give him while making almost no mistakes. Behind him, the Ferraris kept pushing, waiting for the smallest opening, but he refused to give us one. Every braking point was precise. Every exit was clean. He crossed the finish line ahead of cars that, by every technical measurement, should have been faster. That victory reminded everyone in Formula One that machinery doesn't always decide greatness. Sometimes the driver can still tip the balance. People often point out that Stirling Moss never became world champion, and history has a habit of reducing careers to championships. I never agreed with that way of measuring greatness. Anyone who raced against him understood the truth. A title can depend on reliability, timing, or a little luck. Talent doesn't. When I think about Stirling today, I don't think about the championship he never won. I think about a driver who forced everyone around him to become better simply because he was on the grid. That, to me, is a far more lasting legacy than any number beside a driver's name in the record books. And then there was Jim Clark. I've often thought that if someone had never watched Formula One before and asked me to show them what a truly natural racing driver looked like, I would have pointed them toward Jim. There was something almost effortless about the way he drove. Not because the sport was easy for him, but because he never seemed to waste a single movement behind the wheel. Everything looked smooth, balanced, and completely under control. The first time I paid close attention to Jim, what struck me wasn't his lap time, it was how little the car appeared to fight him. In our era, you expected to see corrections, opposite lock, and constant battles with the steering wheel. Jim somehow made even difficult cars look composed. Watching him from the pit wall, you'd think he was driving a completely different machine from everyone else. What made him so extraordinary was never his willingness to take risks. It was his remarkable feel for the car. He understood grip almost instinctively. He seemed to know exactly how much speed a corner would allow before the tires ever began to complain. That gave him an advantage that couldn't be measured by stopwatches alone. While many drivers reacted to what the car was doing, Jim often seemed to anticipate it. His adaptability impressed me just as much. Formula One demanded one set of skills, yet Jim proved he could master almost anything with four wheels. He wasn't interested in proving that he belonged in only one category of racing. He simply wanted to drive, and wherever he went, success usually followed. There was also a humility about him that I always respected. Formula One has never lacked confidence or strong personalities, and perhaps that's necessary in a sport like ours. Jim was different. He carried himself with a quiet honesty that made people like him almost immediately. He didn't seek attention away from the circuit. He let his driving speak for him, and it spoke louder than most drivers ever could. The season that best illustrates his brilliance is 1963. Driving for Lotus, Jim won 7 of the 10 World Championship races he entered that year and secured the title with remarkable authority. It wasn't simply that he won, it was the manner in which he won. He often looked completely comfortable while everyone else struggled to match his rhythm. He made difficult races appear uncomplicated, which is usually the clearest sign that you're watching someone operating at an exceptional level. Then, 2 years later, he reminded the entire racing world that his talent wasn't limited to Formula One. In 1965, he crossed the Atlantic to compete in the Indianapolis 500, one of the most demanding races anywhere. Not only did he win it, but he did so convincingly, leading almost the entire event. At a time when European drivers rarely conquered Indianapolis, Jim showed that genuine greatness wasn't confined by geography or racing categories. Seeing accomplishments like that changed the way I thought about racing drivers. It taught me that true talent doesn't depend on familiar surroundings. Give a truly gifted driver a new challenge, and instead of making excuses, he'll simply learn how to master it. Whenever I remember Jim Clark, I don't immediately think about championships or victories. I remember the feeling he gave everyone fortunate enough to watch him. He made driving at the absolute limit look beautifully simple. Those of us who knew how difficult it really was understood that we were witnessing something very few generations ever get the chance to see. Here's someone who taught me that championships are rarely won by spectacular moments alone. Graham Hill had a way of making Formula One look less like a sprint and more like a marathon. He wasn't always the fastest driver when the weekend began, and there were certainly others who could produce a more breathtaking qualifying lap. But by the time the checkered flag came down on Sunday, Graham always seemed to be exactly where he needed to be. That wasn't luck. It was one of the greatest displays of race intelligence I've ever witnessed. I remember watching him during race weekends and noticing how much time he spent talking with mechanics and engineers. He never treated the people in the garage as if they were simply there to prepare the car. He listened to them, asked questions, and genuinely valued their opinions. Long before drivers became deeply involved in technical development, Graham understood that Formula One was built on teamwork. The confidence he gave the people around him often became an advantage long before the race had even started. What made Graham so different was never raw speed. It was consistency. He understood something that many talented drivers struggled to accept. Winning a world championship wasn't about producing one unforgettable afternoon. It was about making the correct decision hundreds of times throughout an entire season. He knew when to attack, when to settle for valuable points, and when taking unnecessary risks simply wasn't worth it. That approach was on full display during the 1962 season, driving for BRM. Graham fought through one of the most competitive championships Formula One had seen to that point. He claimed 4 Grand Prix victories and secured his first world championship through remarkable consistency rather than domination. Every race seemed to reinforce the same lesson. While others chased perfection every weekend, Graham chased results. More often than not, that proved to be the smarter strategy. His career continued to prove that his talent extended well beyond Formula One. He conquered the Indianapolis 500 in 1966, one of the toughest races in the world, before adding victory at the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1972. To this day, he remains the only driver to complete motorsport's Triple Crown. That achievement wasn't built on natural speed alone. It reflected an ability to adapt to entirely different cars, circuits, and racing philosophies without losing his identity as a driver. What I admired most, though, was his resilience. Our generation raced during one of the most dangerous periods in the sport. Every season brought heartbreak, yet Graham somehow carried himself with optimism, professionalism, and quiet confidence. He never allowed success to make him complacent, and he never allowed disappointment to define him. Whenever I think of Graham Hill now, I don't immediately picture trophies or famous victories. I remember a man who proved that intelligence, patience, and respect for the people around you could build a legacy just as enduring as extraordinary talent behind the wheel. And finally, there's Jack Brabham. Jack never seemed interested in becoming the biggest name in the paddock. He wasn't the sort of driver who attracted attention with bold predictions or dramatic gestures. In fact, if you only watched him for a few minutes, you might completely miss what made him extraordinary. But the longer you spent around him, the more you realize that he understood Formula One in a way very few drivers ever have. The first thing I noticed about Jack was that he thought like an engineer as much as he thought like a racing driver. Most of us climbed out of the car and described what we had felt. Jack wanted to know why the car behaved that way and what could be done to improve it. He could spend hours in the garage discussing suspension, weight distribution, or engine behavior without ever appearing impatient. That curiosity made him an invaluable part of every team he drove for. What made him so different was never just his ability behind the wheel. It was his ability to make everyone around him better. His feedback was clear, logical, and incredibly detailed. Engineers trusted what he told them because it consistently led to better performance. Mechanics respected him because he appreciated the work they did long before the car ever reached the starting grid. Jack understood that championships weren't won by drivers alone. They were built by entire teams working toward the same goal. I always admired how practical he was. He never seemed interested in proving he was the bravest man on the circuit. If pushing harder created unnecessary risk without improving the result, he simply wouldn't do it. That discipline allowed him to stay competitive year after year, while others often let emotion dictate their decisions. He approached racing with patience, and patience usually rewarded him. Nothing illustrates that better than the 1966 Formula One season. After founding motor racing developments with Ron Toronac, Jack achieved something that many believed would never be possible. He won the World Championship driving a Brabham, a car carrying his own name. Even today, he remains the only driver in Formula One history to become world champion in a car built by his own team. That accomplishment wasn't the product of one brilliant afternoon. It reflected years of careful development, intelligent leadership, and an unwavering belief in doing things the right way. Jack taught me that greatness isn't always measured by spectacular overtakes or unforgettable qualifying laps. Sometimes it's measured by the quiet work that happens after everyone else has gone home. The hours spent improving a car, the willingness to solve problems instead of complaining about them, the patience to build something that lasts. When I think about Jack Brabham now, I don't just remember a 3-time world champion. I remember a man who proved that Formula One is as much about building excellence as it is about driving it. He showed all of us that the greatest competitors don't simply race the cars, they help create them. As I sit here all these years later, I realize that Formula One gave me far more than a world championship or a place in the record books. It gave me the privilege of sharing the circuit with men who changed the sport simply by being part of it. Every one of them had a different way of approaching racing, and every one of them taught me something I carried long after I stepped away from the cockpit. The trophies are still there, and history will always remember the champions. But with enough time, statistics begin to fade into the background. What remains are the memories of standing on the starting grid, looking across at drivers you respected, knowing that all of you were willing to risk everything for one more lap. I was fortunate to witness some of the finest racing drivers this sport has ever produced. More importantly, I was fortunate to know the men behind the helmets. That's the part of Formula One I'll always treasure the most, and it's the memory I'll carry for the rest of my life.